So can you tell me, have you taken action with Just Stop Oil?
I took action with Just Stop Oil on day one in Essex at the Purfleet Esso fuel depot.
On Saturday this past weekend, Guardian environment correspondent Damien Gale headed into central London to report on the final protest of climate activist group Just Stop Oil.
How many times did you take action?
Probably 20 or 25 times, but I've only been arrested 4 times.
Only 4 times?
Only 4 times, yes.
And how are you feeling about it?
If you're from the UK, you will undoubtedly know Just Stop Oil. Always in their signature orange, they've chucked powder paint at Stonehenge, soup at Van Gogh's sunflowers, and thrown confetti at Wimbledon.
And another disruption for the second time on Court 18 today.
Their particular brand of protest has made them deeply unpopular among the British public, and many will be very pleased to hear the group are hanging up their high vis.
Why are you in the roads? Why are you in the roads? So is this going to help? Is that going to help?
But they have managed to keep the need to phase out oil, gas and coal on the agenda.
We don't get heard unless we annoy someone, unfortunately. And we're not deliberately annoying someone. Someone just decides to thump us or push us or, because they're angry, and I get that. But that gets us the attention. We then have several people on all sorts of different shows discussing why we're doing it.
So why did Just Stop Oil just stop? And what's next for climate activism? From The Guardian, I'm Madeleine Finlay, and this is Science Weekly. Damien Gale, as a Guardian environment correspondent, you've been reporting on Just Stop Oil and their actions since their inception, really. How did it start?
So Just Stop Oil evolved out of originally Extinction Rebellion. Extinction Rebellion, as we know, burst onto the scene in 2019 with this incredible, almost fortnight-long protest where they blocked 5 major junctions in central London.
It's the campaign group Extinction Rebellion, which has brought Regent Street to a standstill this afternoon. There's got to be at least 2,000 protesters here, and just behind me, they've managed to bring down a pink boat, which has literally been drilled into the floor.
But what emerged from that was a split within the group between people who became concerned at alienating the general public and potentially harming their cause, and those who were more radical, who believed that actually they needed to double down on disruptive tactics in order to get the kinds of attention that would really put their cause onto the front pages and into the public arena. And so after that, we saw the emergence of a group known as Insulate Britain. They began this strategy of blocking motorways and blocking roads in order to try and push the government into acceding to their demand, which was for a program of home insulation to be rolled out across the country. They did lots and lots of protests. They were arrested lots of times. There were some quite dramatic scenes that we saw when they were out protesting. Drivers would get out of their cars, drag them out of the road. And by the end of that, there were quite a limited number of activists involved in it. But what they had achieved was that they put this topic of home insulation right on the public agenda. Just Stop Oil emerged as the successor to that campaign. And they have only one core demand, and that was that the government cease all new licenses for oil exploration in the North Sea. And I think that they felt by having one core achievable demand, that was way more achievable than simply having a huge overarching demand such as solve the climate crisis.
And just give me a sense of who was part of Just Stop Oil. What kind of demographic were they? I mean, how big was the group?
The group was never really that big. Demographically, it was really interesting because it was a mixture of generally people who had either retired or been able to take early retirement or had reached a stage in their life where they had a level of security, or it was younger people who perhaps felt that at their stage of life they had less to lose and less to put at risk from the activities that they were taking part in. But all very radical, all very well-educated people who were really well-informed about the issues that we're facing and have a really acutely tuned social conscience.
And so, Damien, you went along to one of their early protests. At the time, they were targeting oil infrastructure around the country, like terminals and ports. What were their initial aims?
They hoped, I think, by doing that, to answer a criticism which had been posed consistently to climate activists, which was, if your fight is with the fossil fuels and with the elites who are profiting from them, why are you disrupting the general public? Why are you not targeting the very things that you are actually opposed to? And so they began with this strategy of targeting oil terminals up and down the country with the aim of creating a crisis of oil distribution across the south of the UK. And we found that there was actually very nearly a crisis in the distribution of petrol to petrol stations. Queues started to appear at petrol station forecourts with drivers unable to get enough fuel to fill up their cars. But the problem was that this just didn't create as much of a splash as they had anticipated that it might. And I think they then realized that if they were to get the kinds of attention that they needed, they were going to have to shift tactics somewhat. So in parallel with these fuel depot protests, they had done these kinds of cultural iconoclastic actions, which initially were intended as a way to draw attention to the group and to raise awareness that they existed and what they were doing.
What is worth more, art or life? Is it worth more than food? Worth more than justice? Are you more concerned about the protection of a painting or the protection of our planet and people?
And I think what they realized was actually these protests got them far more public attention than the protests which specifically targeted oil infrastructure. And that's where they turned to next. So they deliberately went out and they did controversial things, and they did things which they felt would really push them into the newspapers as much as possible. Their entire strategy was, can we get our protest into the Daily Mail and onto the Daily Telegraph, and can we get a quote from our spokesperson saying why we've done it?
And how would you characterise their success? Because, as you said, some of their protests, like the soup being thrown on Van Gogh's sunflower painting, that was really big news. They managed to hit the headlines. But do you think the actions achieved anything beyond just raising awareness of their cause?
I think speak to an activist from Just Stop Oil and they will say that now it's government policy that there will be no new oil exploration in the North Sea. And they see that as effectively, in a sense, mission accomplished for that campaign. And that's probably why a lot of them have said that they're relaxed about the idea that the campaign is ending. Now, whether or not we can attribute that wholly to Just Stop Oil is probably a slightly more complex question. They certainly did manage to put the issue of oil and gas exploration and oil and gas in the North Sea on the agenda in a way that it had never been. Even people who cared about climate breakdown probably didn't have a laser focus on that particular issue.
And Damien, it wasn't just that they ended up regularly in conflict with the public. In the years that they were operating, Just Stop Oil's members also ended up in conflict with the law. Tell me about how some of the new laws that were passed in the UK around protests impacted the group.
The past 3 years in this country, we've seen 2 really wide-ranging laws passed which have circumscribed people's ability to protest to quite a large extent compared to the freedoms that we had before. In 2022, we had the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Act, which was brought in explicitly as a response to Extinction Rebellion and also Black Lives Matter, which gave police a whole range of new powers to shut down protests on the basis that they could be regarded as too noisy or annoying, When Just Stop Oil came on the scene, and also Insulate Britain, they came with a range of new tactics that weren't necessarily covered by the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Act. And so the government quickly introduced a new bill, the Public Order Bill, which was specifically targeted at the kinds of protests that they were doing. I think most significantly for Just Stop Oil is that the government included in this bill an offence of interfering with key national infrastructure. You would imagine that might be ports, airports, oil terminals, but it was quickly reinterpreted by the police and by the Crown Prosecution Service as applying to almost any road in the country.
This was a big problem for Just Stop Oil, who often blocked roads and did what they called slow march protests, holding up traffic by sitting down or walking really slowly. The new law meant that as soon as they even stepped into a road, they could be arrested.
In parallel with this, the courts started taking a much stricter view of the way they handled climate protesters in the courts. After Extinction Rebellion, lots of climate protesters were prosecuted in relation to offences that they had committed as part of those protests, and they were able to bring evidence into court that their actions were justified given the threat that society and individuals face as a result of the climate crisis. And so what the courts began to do was refuse to give activists this license to talk about the reasons why they've taken part in these protests.
And these two factors really came together in terms of Just Stop Oil's planning of a non-violent direct action on the M25, which resulted in the longest ever sentences for peaceful protests. It was 5 years for one activist and 4 years for the others. Many motorists might have felt like justice was served, but a UN Special Rapporteur said of the M25 arrests that it was a very dark day for fundamental human rights in the UK. How did that impact Just Stop Oil and its members?
Yeah, so the M25 conspiracy trial, I think, probably can be seen as the culmination of further draconian measures in the courts. And we saw 5 activists who had effectively appeared on a Zoom call, calling for volunteers to take part in this campaign of protest they had planned to climb over the gantries on the M25, forcing traffic to be halted. And all of these activists, including Roger Hallam, who is a co-founder of Just Stop Oil, were prosecuted for conspiracy to cause public nuisance. In the court, they decided that they would try to use the court as a site of civil resistance, as they termed it, to explain why it is that this protest was necessary. Judge took a very dim view of that, and their pronouncements in the Zoom call that they were going to effectively paralyse access around London and cause all of this crisis within the capital. And so he decided that they needed to go to jail for sentences which were commensurate with the harm, as he saw it, that they intended to cause.
And so now, Damien, Just Stop Oil have said that they're hanging up their high-vis. Why? What's the reason that they're stopping?
So when you ask Just Stop Oil's own activists, they, as I mentioned earlier, will say that they have achieved their goal. Their core demand was always that there be a moratorium on new oil exploration in the North Sea, and that became part of the Labour manifesto while Just Stop Oil's campaign was underway. And now the government are in, they have enacted that. At the same time, their ability to carry out protests is seriously circumscribed now. And the core group of activists that are part of Just Stop Oil have just been arrested so many times and are facing so many trials now that they need to get through those.
You went along to their final protest on Saturday. What was the mood there? How are they feeling about disbanding Just Stop Oil and the future of their climate activism?
I'm guessing I was expecting to see more disappointment, but they were not disappointed at all, really.
It's all good because there'll be a plan. I'm sure there's a plan, but it's wonderful. It's really celebratory to do it. I think to some extent organisations have a propensity to just fizzle out. So it's really nice to kind of go out on a high.
The only person who really evinced any disappointment from what I could see was Roger Hallam, who, in a recorded message from jail, said that he disagreed with the idea to wind up Just Stop Oil. But I think most other people felt that as a campaign it had run its course, that they had achievements that they could look back on, which they could be proud of. And I also got the very strong impression that although the campaign under its current form is over, at least in terms of its protest phase, there are other things down the line, and they do plan to come back with a new name, a new set of demands, and I'm guessing a new strategy.
And so where do you think climate protest will or can go next? In the context of the UK's legal system, will we see any disruptive action, or are those doing it going to go underground and just not stick around and get arrested?
There will always be those who believe that accountability is the most effective form of protest. And this goes back very much to Roger Hallam's core strategy, which is that he believes that the general public need to see that people are willing to make sacrifices for what they believe in order for them to really get behind the cause. But there are others now who increasingly, given the legal environment, see clandestine actions as maybe the way to go. There's a couple of groups which I've reported on recently. There's one, Shut the System, which has gone around cutting fibre optic cables to insurance companies that they see as culpable for financing fossil fuel companies. Another group has gone slightly more extreme by taking a drill to the tyres of 4x4s at car dealerships. And so it does seem as though, given the legal penalties of taking part in accountable civil disobedience, that actually some people are making the calculation that the penalties they face may at this stage not be any worse than the penalties you might face for something that you take ownership of.
Well, Damien, it's going to be interesting to see how all this evolves, but thank you so much.
Yeah, no problem.